Hannah wants to tell me about her friend Esther. She is sitting across the table from me, and even before she begins, I can feel how hard this story is going to be for her. It's apparent in the pain that lingers in her eyes, even when she smiles, and the way she sometimes pauses in her speech, as if suddenly afraid that she might give voice to something unspeakable. Hannah and Esther had grown up as children, living next door to each other. They were almost exactly the same age, and from the time they first began to walk, they had been inseparable. The two girls were together constantly. They shared everything. They shared their clothes, they shared their secrets, they shared their hopes. They were closer than any sisters. The times were the 1920s and 30s, though. The place was the Jewish ghetto in a small town in eastern Germany. As Hannah described it, the ghetto, the section where the Jews were required to live, was only a few streets. The lines dividing it from the rest of the town hardly even noticed. Everyone, Christian and Jew alike, knew exactly where everything about everyone. What in this small town, the changes that came after for the Jews after Adolf Hitler was elected to power in 1933 came slowly, but they mounted steadily. More and more, the Jews were restricted. Jewish businesses were forced to close. Attacks and persecutions became increasingly common. What was so strange, Hannah says to me in that soft voice of hers, was that these people weren't strangers or some occupying force. They were people we thought of as our friends. She pauses and looks at me. We went into their stores, they came into ours. We played with their children. Yes, there was a Jewish section and a Christian section, but until all this began, it was one town. But then, little by little, the thugs took control and our friends just watched. Perhaps the injuries and injustices just seemed too small to bother about at first, or to risk doing anything about. But they got worse, much worse. And throughout it all our friends said nothing. Then one day the soldiers came and told us we had to leave. We were going to be resettled in the camps. With that, she closes her eyes and gives her head a small shake. This is followed by a wave of her hand as if to say, you know what happens next. For several moments, she remains silent. When she speaks again, her already quiet voice has grown even quieter. She does not describe the long train ride to the camp in which she and all her neighbors were pressed so closely together into cattle cars that many died of cold or suffocation. She also related almost nothing about the camp itself. About that, she says only three things. The first is that every man, woman, and child who remained in that camp died. The second is that among those who stayed in that camp were her entire family, her parents, her grandparents, her brothers and sisters, her aunts and uncles, her cousins. The third thing she says, though, was that of her whole village, only two were set aside to go somewhere else. She was one, Esther was the other. Both were 17. Both were strong, healthy, and beautiful young women. At that point, Hannah's gaze broke from mine. She looks away. The Nazis thought they could make use of us, she said simply, not looking at me. I nod. I know what she means. For months, Hannah and Esther were sent from camp to camp. Somehow they always managed to stay together. The two girls who had been inseparable from childhood were now much more than that. Each had become the other's lifeline. They still shared everything they had, but now that they had so little, this became a matter of life and death. If one found a little extra food, she shared that. A little extra courage, a little extra hope. She shared that too. By the winter of 1944, the girls were still alive, but completely spent. If 12 months earlier they had been healthy young women, they were that no longer. They were depleted, drained, close to starvation. The Nazis were still not finished with them, though. They were sent to one final camp. This was a slave labor camp, and it was among one of the most brutal of its kind. Its job was to repair roads damaged by Allied bombs. The place needed a constant supply of new workers because every day that the teams went out, they came back with so many fewer than they started with. Many of the workers collapsed with fatigue. Others merely gave up and lay down on the road. Either way, the result was the same. They were simply shot. Soldiers guarding them didn't hesitate. To lie down was to die. The instant a guard spotted someone lying down, he raised his rifle and fired. The work itself was relentless, backbreaking. Day after day, they dug, pounded rocks, carried loads of gravel. It went on from before dawn to well after dark. As bad as this was, though, Hannah now had an even greater worry. After all that they had gone through, it was becoming clear to her that Esther, too, had begun to give up. Esther no longer ate unless Hannah forced her. She never spoke, never responded to anything Hannah said. Most troubling of all was that Hannah's gaze was now taken on the same empty stare that Hannah had seen in so many others in their final days, a stare of someone who no longer cared whether they lived or died. Then one afternoon, what she feared most happened. Hannah and Esther were digging together, clearing away rubble, when suddenly Esther stopped. She stood immobile, gazing into the distance. Slowly, she let the shovel she was carrying clatter to the ground. "What are you doing?" Hannah whispered, horrified. She quickly bent down, picked up the shovel, and handed it back to Esther, but her friend wouldn't take it. Her hands hung limp at her side. Her eyes, dull and glazed, had not left the horizon. "Esther, Esther," Hannah repeated in a desperate undertone. "Take the shovel before they see you." Esther did not respond. Instead, to Hannah's horror, she slowly began to lie down. She stretched out right there in the middle of the road for all to see. Hannah knew that this was certain death. "Stop it," she whispered. "Stop it. Get up. Are you crazy?" Frantically, Hannah looked around. Where was the guard? Where was the guard? She couldn't find him anywhere. Then she noticed the guard, but it with his back to him. She knew that if the guard turned around now, they would both be dead. But quickly she lay down beside her friend. She grabbed Esther's shoulders and shook her. "Get up," she said. "They'll kill you." "What does it matter?" Esther answered. "Nothing matters anymore." That's not true. That's not true." Frantically, Hannah tried to think what she could say to convince her. She knelt closer, bringing her lips right to Esther's ear. "No, it's not true," she said again. "You have to get up because you have to live, Esther. You have to live. You have to survive this, Esther. You have to survive this. Yes, you're going to survive this, and you're going to marry, Esther. You're going to marry and have a child, a little boy, and I'm going to survive this too. And I'm also going to marry and have a child, a little girl. Those children are going to grow up, Esther. They're going to marry and have a child, and that child will be our grandchild, Esther, yours and mine. That's why you have to get up, for the sake of our grandchild, Esther. If you don't get up, that child will never be born. At that point, Anna paused in her story. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched tightly on the table between us. Several moments passed. Then she looked up at me. "What do you think made me say that?" she asks. "Do you have any idea?" What do you think made me say that? I've thought about that so often, that question. Where does hope come from, after all? Look at today's gospel. What is so significant about this reading is that it immediately follows the passage that what is perhaps the pivotal point in the entire Gospel of Mark. The verses where Jesus asks his followers, "Who do you say I am?" To this, Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." Now, in today's reading, after just having told his disciples that he, Jesus, the man standing before them, is the very one for whom Israel has been waiting throughout its history, the one on whom all their hopes hang, Jesus immediately goes on to say something that seems to destroy all that. He says that he will soon undergo great suffering. He will be rejected. He will be killed. At this, Peter rebukes him. And who can blame him? Jesus has just told him that he is the Messiah, the hope of humanity. But is this hope suffering, rejection, death at the hands of his enemies? True, Jesus also mentions something about rising on the third day, but what does that mean? You can almost hear Peter's disappointment, his anger. Suffering, rejection, death? Is this what you have to offer? You call this hope? And yet Jesus' response is unequivocal. To Peter, the man who only minutes before has recognized him as the Messiah, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He then goes on, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose it for my sake will save it." Harsh words? They seem that way. In fact, though, Jesus is completely redefining the concept of hope. For Jesus, hope is not something occasional or incidental to life. Instead, hope forms the very core of religious experience. Jesus is making hope the central reality of our relationship to God. The thing is, this is a hope not built on outcomes. It is, in other words, a hope that does not depend on things turning out the way we want. It is instead a hope that finds its beginning and its end in the same thing: complete trust in who we are in relationship to God. Beings loved by God, held by God, beings carried by God through all darkness, through all despair, through all evil. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things, Jesus tells Peter. Hope is divine. Optimism is merely human. Optimism is the belief that things will work out the way we want and be okay. Hope is the conviction that even if things do not work out the way we want, they will still be okay because God is with us. That is our hope. God is love, after all. Our call is only to give that love, which is God, as fully and unequivocally as we can. We do this in the certain knowledge that ultimately that love will prevail, even if we do not. It will live long after we die. It will triumph even where evil seems to have gotten the upper hand. Who will separate us from the love of God? Paul asks in the 8th chapter of Romans. Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or the sword? Such hope is itself God's great gift. The hope that in the end, love will survive. Love will always survive. This love is the only miracle we truly need. And yet, having encountered that miracle, sometimes, Hannah tried one last time. Get up, she said to Esther again. Get up for our grandchild. That child needs our love. Esther, do you hear me? That child needs our love. For the first time, Esther turned to look at her. She gazed at her strangely. Moments passed. Then slowly she stirred. She rolled over onto her side, then little by little began to get up. Again, Hannah glanced around, looking for the guard. She saw that he had started to turn back to them. Hannah grabbed Esther and pulled her to her feet, but when she looked again, it was too late. The guard had his rifle on his shoulder. It was pointed directly at Esther. Don't worry, Hannah called out to him, waving wildly. We're working. Everything's fine. We're working. For a moment, the three figures stood as still as a photograph. Two emaciated girls and a soldier with a rifle pointed at them. Sarah saw him move his finger to the trigger. She closed her eyes. Dear God, no, she whispered. Seconds passed. When she opened her eyes again, the soldier hadn't moved. At last, he made a quick motion with his gun, telling them to continue, then lowered his weapon and turned away. Silently, Sarah began to weep. It was only 2 weeks later that we woke up one morning to find all the guards had vanished, Hannah said to me. The machine gun turrets were empty. The soldiers had left. We couldn't believe it. Later that afternoon, the Americans arrived. Hannah and Esther spent several months in refugee camps. Then each decided to try to locate any family they had left. Esther had a cousin in Paris. Hannah had one surviving uncle in New York, her mother's brother, a man she had never met. For the first time in their lives, the two women parted. In New York, Hannah began to learn English and to attend classes at the university. It was there that she met a young medical student, an American, also Jewish. They were married, and when he finished his medical training, they moved to Maine, where he set up practice. It was in Maine that I got to know her. Over the years, Hannah and her husband had 4 children. Hannah kept in touch with Esther, who also was now married and living in Paris. Esther had 2 sons. When Esther's eldest son, Emil, was 18, he came to live for a year with Hannah's family in Maine to work on his English. Soon after he returned home, Hannah's second child, a girl named Sophie, went to live with Esther's family in Paris to study French. 2 years later, Esther's son Emil and Hannah's daughter Sophie announced their plans to marry. It was 1 year following that marriage that Hannah found herself on a flight to Paris. As she came through customs, the first person she saw was Esther, now middle-aged. In her arms, Esther held an infant, a newborn. This child was her grandchild, the child was Hannah's grandchild also. As Hannah approached, she saw that Esther's eyes were filled with tears. "How did you know?" Esther asked softly. "How did you ever know?" At that point, Hannah pauses. Again, she looks down at her hands, then returns her gaze to me. "How did I know?" she asked me at last. "Do you have any idea? How did I know?" Amen.